Today on MIT's Data Nation, we're flipping the script. He's usually my co-host, but today Munther Dahleh is my guest, and for good reason. Munther is a world-renowned expert in control theory and complex networks, and a leading voice on the intersection of data technology and social impact as a professor of electrical engineering at MIT. He is the author of the new book, Data Systems and Society: Harnessing AI for Societal Good. It truly is a powerful exploration of how data and artificial intelligence can be used not just to build better tech, which is important, but to build a better world as well. We are going to dive into how we can design systems that are fair, resilient, and truly serve society. But I also want to ask Munther something deeper. How do we use data not just to solve the world's biggest challenges, but to navigate our own individual lives? How do we live data and not just analyze it? This is a conversation truly about ethics, design, power, and a little bit of the personal. So let's get into it. So our fabulous assistant producers came up with some questions that, were, how do you align being an engineer with data science and all this stuff? And I deleted all of them. And we're going with some of my questions here, Munther. So get ready. Let's start off with something easy. So much of your work has been about using data for good, and has taken a lot of the principles and insights you've seen in data, not necessarily data not for good, but maybe data for commercial purposes or whatever, and you've applied that knowledge and using it for things that would not necessarily get the attention or money to get fixed. So can you name for me what you see as the top, let's say, 3 to 5 challenges currently facing the country or the world that you feel that data for good could fix? So top 3 to 5 things.
Well, I'm gonna turn this question around a little bit and say, and then I'll try to answer your question, Liberty. But first of all, I do want to say that data has become the most important thing that we need. So, is this a different statement that I would have made in 1995 or 2005? Yes, because at that time I would have said algorithms and computing and all of that is all very important. That has become a commodity. Slowly, algorithms are becoming standards. Computing time is becoming standards. But what is not a standard is new data. And the key contributions of the future are going to be solved by the new data and the creative way that new data is collected. So, yeah, LLMs and ChatGPT are generative models that produce data, but they produce existing data or mimics of existing data. They're not going to solve cancer problem for us. They're not going to find the cure by just creating generative data from an existing repertoire of data that we have. The group that's going to solve cancer are the ones that are going to conduct that one experiment and collect that data set that is going to make a huge difference. And I would say that healthcare problems like cancer, Alzheimer, Parkinson's, all of these things, they're going to be solved. Those are top of my priority list as problems that need to be solved with the right data set, and the right experiment and the setup that's going to create that experiment. I've often said, and I said that in the book, I think genomics are going to be the most important problems that we're going to look at in the next decade, when the AI sort of frenzy calms down a little bit and we look around into the domains. Well, genomics is going to be an incredible area where it's going to be so much going on. We are already able to edit the gene. And to what extent are we going to allow this to happen at the fetus level? And who's going to have access to it? It's going to be expensive and it's going to create bias and so forth. And, rich people will be taller and stronger and poor people won't be. And I'm advocating thinking about this before it happens, but it's all happening because we are collecting the data and we are manipulating the data that matters.
So, can you give me an example when you say an experiment that's going to be totally different than something that's happened before, and it's going to be this experiment, this data set that solves whatever health issue? Can you give me an example of what that means? Like, how does it look so different?
Well, it's a scientific process. The scientific process is we conduct experiments, and based on those, we either validate existing models or invalidate the previous models, and we create a new model, and we continue to move. So, what is an interesting data? Let's stay with cancer. We do think that gene therapy and genetic manipulations are going to be the next way in which cancer is going to be solved. So think of it this way: we have T cells. That the purpose of the T cell is to attack a new foreign element that comes into our body, but they're not really targeted enough. And so what we want to do is we want to edit them to target a particular type of cancer that's in your body. Okay, well, there's many other problems. So, you can edit, but then you inject them into the body, and then they die very quickly. They're not stable. Someone is going to conduct that experiment and does that manipulation, combining their understanding of genetics and biology, that will actually create a stable T cell. By the way, that has been done for certain types of cancer, but not all types of cancer. So the next step will be that next experiment, that next wet lab data that is collected, that then will allow us to extrapolate and say, okay, it worked, for this type. How can we make it work for that type, and so forth? So this is what I mean by the next data point.
And so let's take one of these problems. Let's move away from health a little bit because I think people can imagine how health would be
Mm.
would be changed by data. I think that's a very graspable concept. So let's take something else. Let's take another major issue facing the world. Let's take conflicts because I think that's one that isn't necessarily really obvious how data would solve something like that. So let's take you pick Ukraine, Russia, Palestine, Israel. You pick a conflict and sort of walk us through what data could do to help with one of these issues.
Well, I think that it's sort of. I don't want to make it sound that data is the answer right away. I do want to say that data is important, and it comes together with the understanding of the context. Contextual data is really important. A big thing that I advocate in the book is understanding the societal challenge that you're dealing with. First, I'm not interested in using data, nor that I'm interested in using AI. I'm interested in solving a problem. Okay, it's always the case, and the problem is about the society and for the society. The societal challenges are unique in that we're trying to solve the problem for the people, but people are part of the problem. They're not an external entity to the problem. And so, how do I start thinking about a conflict between Russia and Ukraine? You know, I have to start thinking about the societal challenge that we have in place. We have, at a basic level, a country invading another country. At a more detailed level, we have complex demographics. Ukraine isn't that separable from Russia. And we have a history of once upon a time, Ukraine was part of the same entity that Russia was part of. And then we have external factors, interventions, people who have vested interest in having a situation in one place or another. The objective for us, I think we can agree very quickly, is we want to end the war, we want peaceful borders, and we want long peace. We're not talking about a truce for a month. So that's the objective. But in order to arrive there, and maybe think of yourself as a negotiator and you're going to try to figure out how to make this happen. Now data becomes really important to you. Why? Because you really need to understand the context, and the context matters a lot. The context in Palestine is different than Ukraine, you know. So when we need to understand the context, we need to understand the various incentives and drivers that apply to both, to Ukraine and to Russia separately and together. We need to understand the European bloc and their incentive system and their intervention in the process. So this is all data that comes together for the negotiators to try to propose hypotheses for what could be a peaceful resolution. Those are now hypotheses that would say potentially we could do something like this. Okay. Now, where data can help you in understanding these hypotheses is what I call synthetic controls, which is now the world wasn't created yesterday, and the conflict between Russia and Ukraine is not the only conflict, and we had history of conflicts. We can go back to that data, try to understand what has worked in those situations and what hasn't worked. One of the biggest problems that we do in general is that we imagine a particular situation. We think that we're aligned incentively with incentives are aligned with both parties and so forth, but we don't think about the unintended consequences. And so what we create something that seems right, but actually makes one person or another group more vulnerable. So that's what I mean by solving the problem. It's not a magic bullet, and it's not like, oh, I know if you just give me the data, I have the answer. It's a process, and it has what's complicated about it. There's historical aspect of the data, contextual aspect of the data, and humans, people that are complex players in this game that react to incentives and often are fighting and having a conflict entirely based on a concept, on an idea. I mean, I used to, when I was a lot younger, I used to think we fight over resources. That's why we fight for resources. If the resources were available, there's no reason for us to fight. But I think I'm wrong. I think we fight on ideas, you know and that's part of the reason why religions have actually contributed to conflicts. They're not intended to create conflicts, but it's an unintended part of religion, is that now my idea is right, your idea is right, we have a conflict. And so we fight on ideas, and that's why we are a complicated species to try to come up with a peaceful resolution, because to what extent your idea can be manipulated or changed, or can I convince you that this idea is not the right idea? And so data on that and knowledge and all of this have to be acquired for the negotiator to understand all of these pieces to try to come up with a resolution.
Yeah, it makes sense, especially when you add in the data sort of behind misinformation, disinformation, especially in today's age of social media. It makes it a thousand, probably way more than a thousand times harder, a million times harder with the amount of sort of data that's getting pushed around. What what do you think is different about the data that we have now, or are just really in the past couple of years are starting to have access to, that would allow for solving some of these problems better or worse?
Well, I mean, on the science side, I mean, our instrumentation and our ability to measure things we could not measure before clearly is amazing, and clearly is opening up doors for us. So those are scientific problems that hold a lot of promise. Now, on the and these are socially driven problems, right? I still think of them as a societal challenge. I mean, cancer is a societal challenge because at some point you're going to take resources and put it in that research. Those resources are going to be taken from people. You could have been feeding people with that money instead. So this resource allocation problem, whether it was actually rigorously thought about or not, is actually addressing this particular societal challenge on the expense of something else, right? So I think of all of this as a societal challenge. But when you talk about social problems, addiction, pandemics, all of that stuff, where at the social side, of course, the data is really great, but as you just mentioned, the data is covered with a lot of misinformation and disinformation. You think about, those of us who grew up reading physical newspapers and physical books. When the internet came, we were very, very, very excited that we have access to this information, that I don't have to go and buy the newspaper. I can get it to my desk to come to me. What we didn't anticipate at that time is the creation of echo chambers, and the fact that actually at the end of the day, you're only reading what you like to read. And that, in fact, what we thought as a democratization of information across all nations and across time and space turned out to be not true. What is true now is actions allowing people to push information that is not true, and having an inability to actually verify all of this information, right or wrong. And so in social conflicts, the elections, if I want to make a decision on which candidate I want to go to, it's very, very confusing, right? If I just sit back and I'm observing the data that comes to me, I'm not going to come up with a good conclusion. Everybody is saying whatever they feel like, and they're playing on my weaknesses and my strength. And but if I dig, I find it. But digging is back to the old-fashioned exercise of me doing the research. But I can't be doing the research on election, on conflicts of the world, on whether Powell should be reducing the interest rates, on whether or not I should search for the right plumber for my house. And when I have a pain in my knee, that I know exactly what the solution to that problem is. The expectations is that you have to know everything. This pressure on us that, you know, well, you need to know who your best candidate. You need to know this. I always joke with my wife, because bringing a plumber to the house for some trivial problem could cost you $500, especially in Boston. So she says, like, well, like, I should learn how to do this, but I'm totally useless. I don't know how to do this, right? So I would tell her I will do it with one condition, and that is, when I get sick, I'm going to call the plumber to teach my class,
There you go.
you know? But that doesn't happen. The plumber is not teaching my class. And so this information and data that is available, pushed on us and so forth, is making us feel that we are empowered to do certain things, but we are not really. And I think that that's a challenge. It's not as obvious as science, where the data has a direct path to an answer.
It's really interesting. I can't remember what it was where we just bought a new house, and the other day I said to my husband, "Oh, can you fix this?" And he goes, "No." And I was like, "Oh, just YouTube
No.
it." And he's like, "No, I'm not going to do that."
Yeah. And you can YouTube, and this is interesting, right? So you can YouTube something, and sometimes you're successful. If you count how often you're successful, it's probably
Yeah.
10%.
And the rest of the
You
time,
know,
you cost yourself more money because somebody has to fix
more
what you've
money because
done.
you screw it up. Someone has to fix what you've done. You've spent a lot of time on it, and you've actually gone out of your game, because that's not what you do. You do something else. There's someone out there that does that thing better than you. That's why they have their career focused on that. But somehow, because we're led to believe that, oh, but then this can be done, we actually engage it, and there are losses and frustrations that come out of it. And so we don't have a systematic way of addressing these issues.
Absolutely. He's a lawyer. So instead of billing hours, he's trying to YouTube whatever,
Yeah,
whiteboard I wanted or something. Yeah.
yeah.
Very interesting concept with the amount of new information and new data we have. So, okay, here's where I want to go back to your concept of unintended consequences, because I think that's a really important aspect to all of this. I remember from really when I was little, my dad used to work at the UN, and the example he would always use of unintended consequences were when the Vietnamese boat people were escaping, the Thai pirates would, either would steal from them, rape the women, but they'd let them go. And so then there was a big commission to try to find these pirates and punish them. And the unintended consequence was then the pirates just killed all the Vietnamese boat people instead of letting them live. So, there's these really truly high stakes unintended consequences that we've seen. And so I want to actually go back to one that you mentioned earlier, which is the genomics, and how rich people are going to have healthier, smarter babies and poor people aren't going to be able to afford that. How does that work? And how could we stop something like that? Or is that just the way of the world? And is that capitalism at its sort of most I don't even know what word to use, egregious or sort of, I mean, it just feels so icky. But on the other hand, it's capitalism. I don't, how would we fix something like that?
Yeah, I think this is a great question. One thing you mentioned before is that I use data for corporations and profits and financial investment and so forth. But really, in reality, over the last few years, I've become a lot less interested in any utilitarian use of data, and thinking very hard about capitalism and the power of money. How do we fix these problems? I mean, we have to eliminate the power of money, because frankly speaking, currently in the United States, we don't regulate anything. I mean, we regulate some things, but money is able to change whatever we do. There's power to it, power in terms of influencing the decision makers, the policy makers, and so as a result, we have inequities. You know, sometimes they're straightforward, and sometimes they're not. But someone who's affluent, their kids go to top schools. We already have that problem. If you grow up in an underserved community, your kids are not getting the same education as someone else. That's already there. So the problem of healthcare is already there. There's discrepancy, and this around the world, right? It's the same story. Money is able to provide you with answers, and if you don't have it, you don't have those answers. And so we have the problem of genomics. The only thing is that there the scale is going to be a little scary,
Yes.
in terms of, I mean, we feel like, okay, my God, okay, now the division and the separation between people is going to be so much more.
And it's a sort of
Uh,
a
and
creepy issue just in general to think about.
yeah, yeah. Although, you think about in Japan right now, they do use this as a way of eliminating disease.
Yes.
And so you can actually see how you do it in a positive way, and there are positive ways of doing things. Typically, technology and innovation have come before our social and humanistic understanding of them, and so we've always been catching up, you know and so sometimes we do the right things. Often I think over the long run we tend to do the right thing because of our just a sense of preservation, I would say. I do remember the days when, I mean, I'm old enough, and I grew up in part of the world where the TV was introduced in 1970 or 1968 or something close to that time. And I don't remember exactly the conversation in 1968, but I do remember throughout my time when I was growing up, the adults in my community talking about the evil TV. Well, because it's distracting you from reading. It's a passive way of engaging, right? It's not verifiable because you don't control, all of the stuff that we worry about. But TVs didn't turn out to be that bad, and they didn't destroy us. And in fact, we turned them into educational tools and what have you. You know, a sociologist may argue differently, but it hasn't been detrimental. But this could be problematic. And by the time it's introduced and we're able to make the changes and edit the genome and so forth, I think, we would not have put in all these things in place. So I have been actually part of my sabbatical, spending some time at the Broad Institute, been having conversations with people about being ready with these concepts,
So
ready with
not
the
catching
regulation,
up,
ready,
being right.
not catching up, because catching up in that world can be a little too
Yeah.
late, just a little too late.
And when you say it, it's sort of these insidious changes. So, for example, I got my eggs frozen, 5 years ago or whatever, and they check the eggs for disease. And at the time, you're like, well, that sounds like that's a good thing to do. And then I know friends who have done IVF, and they can choose whether they want a male or a female. And I've always thought, to each their own. If that's what you want to do, go for it. But you can see how these increase in the data science knowledge and the ability to engineer these things, this sort of stepwise thing, to all of a sudden now you can pay to have a really smart, really strong, really attractive, whatever child. Do you think it's possible, though, to have the regulation ready? I mean, we've seen it with things like data science has enabled facial recognition, and we've seen sort of the horrible unintended consequences that have happened to people. I mean, there's an entire genocide going on with the Uyghur people that's all based off of facial recognition technology. We've seen horrible, horrible consequences because it just wasn't regulated quickly enough. So, I mean, do you think that's even possible to regulate something like that quickly enough?
Well, I want to say that there is a bit of a discrepancy in the United States, at least here, between regulation of artificial intelligence and biology and medicine. I think biology and medicine are much more regulated, a lot more involvement by the scientific community. We have very strict protocols of how you administer. Well, first of all, protocols for allowing a certain drug to go to market, and we have protocols for how they administered. And so I feel like if we continue down that path, we will be in a good shape, because I mean, all the scientists that are working on this work are aware of many of the unintended consequences, and they will be putting it in the right place. So that gives me a little bit of hope. As we've seen in artificial intelligence and tech has been a lot less regulated and exploding fairly rapidly. and has a different standard in terms of adoption. You know, I mean, like adoption is just if you can sell it, you can adopt it because it's assumed that it's not assumed to have all these kind of negative impacts. So yeah, I do think that it is possible to have sufficient regulation to kind of slowly roll it into the market.
That makes a lot of sense that there's so much more control around this sort of medical stuff that's really scary. That makes a lot of sense. What about the bias that's going to come in? One of the things that I do think we've probably gotten, and I disagree with me, probably gotten pretty good at is recognizing that there's bias in data that we collect. First, could you give us an example of what you think is one of the biggest biases that we've seen in data? Sort of an example of when things went really wrong because of the bias that was collected in the data. And sort of how do we protect against that in the future, especially if it's in ways that we may not necessarily see or understand right now?
Well, the worst part of the bias in the data is the reinforcement of a bias. Think of underserved community, they don't have access, and then as a result they're not able to build capital because of that. And so it reinforces the surveillance problem that was well documented, for example, where you're monitoring certain neighborhoods, and as a result you catch more crime, you add more police, you catch more crime, you add more police, and then you declare that this is a problem in that neighborhood. But a lot of what I think happens again in certain areas, like healthcare, is big in that. Is the bias created by feedback, right? Confirmation bias or selection bias. When we were dealing with COVID-19, one of the biggest problems we were having is the first data sets that we were getting were coming from hospitals, but people that went to the hospital were people of a certain type of illness. And so we created a concept of what this virus can do based on this group of people. But this group of people are not all the people that got the virus. And we didn't have that data. And we were making decisions based on this group of people, and many of them died. Right. And so people always say this was we overreacted with the lockdown and so forth. And I'm saying it's not that we overreacted, we reacted. And we reacted to data sets that we were gathering at that time. I mean, I'm talking about essentially April 1st to April 15th, right, of 2020. So, that time we have started collecting data, a lot of older people, a lot of people dying from this, a lot of issues with the lungs, and we didn't know how to deal with it. And so we formulated opinions about this. Later on, we discovered that there are more factors and more things. So of course, science is growing. It's not stagnant. Science is based on the data that you have. You do the best you can, and you continue to measure. But those are biases, and they are based on who is reporting the data. You know, you don't have this randomized concept all the time that you're going out and randomizing. That doesn't exist in real life. Observational data is often biased. And so we always have to be aware of this fact as we collect data sets.
So I think I have 8,000 more questions, but I know we have to wrap up soon. So I think I'll end with this, which I know your book addresses all of this on a much deeper level and really fabulous thoughts and ideas and examples behind all these kind of questions. But sort of in a final sense, data for good is wonderful, but we also all like to think about how things can be useful for ourselves in our own personal lives. So, in what ways can people apply data science in their personal or professional lives, whether it's making smarter business decisions or improving productivity or managing choices more effectively? What advice would you give for how people can use these sort of incredible advances that we have to help themselves personally?
This is a great question because in a way, these advances and the amount of data available to people has actually caused more anxiety than help. At least my anecdotal observations, and could be wrong if you did the experiment, but exactly what we were saying before, because everyone feels like I should be able to do better in this space. I should invest my money better because there's a lot of data on investment. I should know what schools to put my kids in, because and we go crazy with the selection of the schools and analyzing the data that comes out of the schools. So maybe I would say less data will help people psychology a little bit better.
I like that. I feel like I should be so much more productive with Chat GPT, and I'm not. And then it stresses me out that other people are using it better than I am.
Yeah, I've been trying to. I wanted to buy an electric bike for me and my wife, although I've resisted very hard because I like biking as an exercise. But I rode a couple of electric bikes, and I thought, that will make me kind of it's fun. It's kind of fun to have. And it's hard to get advice on electric bikes because not many people have tried them. Your friends, not many of them have them. So I went to ChatGPT and gave me side by side analysis and comparison. And I, same as you, I was so stressed out. I couldn't make up my mind, on this thing. I want to make a good decision. So I asked a few people, and then I got much more from their experience than I was getting from there. So my advice then is stay away from that kind of data. Focus on the things that will make you happy. That's the data I will take first and foremost. Just focus on the things that will make you happy. Try to understand what makes you happy. Actually, the data science aspect of this is ask the right question. That's the most important piece of it. The right question is, well, what makes me happy? Then look at the data of the things that you've done in the past that made you happy, and just do more of it.
I think that is the perfect ending. And I love that as the ending summary of the new book, Data Systems in Society, Harnessing AI for Societal Good, that I know all of our listeners are going to read. It's really worth the time to read it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this month's episode of Data Nation from the MIT Institute for Data Systems in Society. You can learn more about IDSS and listen to previous episodes at our website, idss.mit.edu, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you to our producers, Tina Toby Mack, and assistant producers, Ben Stull and Maria Brooks. Don't forget to leave us a review and follow our Twitter at MIT IDSS to stay informed. Thank you again for listening to MIT's Data Nation.